Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to admit it to myself for the first time in my life, but I am short, so I'm going to shrink this mic. I do not like to see myself as a short person, but at last I am. So how did I get here? Besides the obvious of being invited to be with you guys, which is a great pleasure, I planted a church in Pasadena about 7 years ago. We moved out to LA 10 years ago. We were planted by a church in New York, Redeemer, which is Tim Keller's church. And then this last year, we started something called Together LA, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. But you may say, well, how did you get to plant a church with Tim Keller? And it's because we had some mutual connections. We're both part of the same denomination. My wife and I were looking to plant a church in New York, and Tim went to the same seminary that I went to, and Biola's president was there at the same time that I was there. And so at Gordon Conwell, we really grabbed hold of this thing called Reformed theology. And turns out that Tim Keller had the same professor who taught me my Reformed theology and his Reformed theology, and that led to us getting involved in the same denomination, and then that led to us being part of this church planting organization. That led to us being part of a ministry in New York that eventually sent us out to plant in LA. Well, how did this connection at Gordon Conwell happen with this professor who teaches Reformed theology? Well, this professor had been there for a little while by the time I had taken him, but when Tim was there, the professor had barely gotten there. In fact, it was by a miraculous event that he was even able to be there. He was a British scholar, and at the last minute was supposed to come over, but his visa didn't work out, and he couldn't get there, which meant that if he hadn't been there, Tim wouldn't have been taught Reformed theology and wouldn't have ended up in the same denomination as me and wouldn't have planted a church in New York that had gathered us and sent us out to LA. Well, how did the professor actually get to Gordon Conwell? Well, there was a student at Gordon Conwell at the same time that Tim was there, and his name was Mike Ford. And Mike called his dad, who happened to be President Ford at the time, and said, hey, would you pull some strings and get this guy to come? We need this professor at Gordon Conwell so that he can teach Tim and all the others that would eventually send Brannin out to Los Angeles to start this thing called Together LA. Okay, great. Well, how did Ford become president, right? To send this professor to Gordon Conwell to teach Tim and to teach myself and to send us out to LA to start Together LA. How did this Gerald Ford become president, right? Because of Watergate. So that's why I'm here. I'm here because of Watergate. So that's what I thought I'd tell you at first. How many of you actually checked out awkward moments, Children's Bible, while David was talking? Anybody actually do that? I did. I didn't have long enough before he saw me and said, and he's checking out his phone, but I did check it out. It's pretty hilarious. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Together LA. Our goal, Together LA was a question, and we did ask Tim to come out years and years and years ago. We were having a conversation as church planners who were out here and saying, what would it mean to have Tim Keller come out and do something for our city to help us grow and to start a momentum and get folks connected in the city. We thought about church planting. Let's have Tim come out and talk about church planting. So quickly it became this mobilization of several churches together to talk about church planting. And as we said, what does it mean to plant churches in Los Angeles? We quickly realized we can't do that as a bunch of white guys talking about planting churches in Los Angeles, who most of us had just moved to Los Angeles. So we put it on hold for a little bit and started to say, what does it mean for us to actually love our city? That was the question that really arose from those conversations. And we said, well, if we begin to ask and answer the question, what does it mean to love our city? That's kind of this weird question to ask. What do you mean, love the city? What does that look like? What does that do? And as we began to ask that question, it quickly became obvious that we couldn't ask and answer that question alone. We needed to do that with other folks who were part of the city, who'd been part of the city, who were the makeup and the fabric of the city, who blood, sweat, and tears and years and years and years invested in the city, had much more to say and offer than anything that we could possibly imagine. These are folks whose churches and ministries and businesses may never get the national recognition that some others do, but are deeply invested into the community. At that point, my personal desires actually changed. And I was one of those kids years and years and years ago who said, well, I'll plant a church, and at 25, I'll have 25,000 folks, and I'll have a great name, and it'll be wonderful, and I'll write books, and I'll do all these kinds of wonderful things that all these other folks, as soon as they hear my story, they'll just say, amazing, we just have to come to Jesus because of it. So it'll be wonderful, it'll be great. But as we started talking to these folks in the city, and as we started talking about what does it mean to really love your city, I think God placed a different vision on my mind and my heart. And I understand the irony of what I'm about to tell you, that God, I think, is leading into my life. But the irony is this, is that I feel there's a new calling on my life, and that's to connect folks in this city, to be connected, to be together, to enable thousands and thousands of ministries to happen, and for lots and lots and lots of people to come to Christ through it, and lots of businesses and entrepreneurs to engage in their city, and my name never to be known. I want to die where no one knows my name. And I get the irony of being up here sharing with you about Together LA and what we're trying to do, but that really is the purpose. And when you start to paint this picture of what a conference like Together LA looks like, people want to say it's church planting, or it's business ministry, or it's marketplace ministry, or it's mercy ministry, or what is it? Until you actually see it, until you're part of it, you don't really understand what it's about. It's really an artistic expression of the church in Los Angeles coming together to be one body that says we intend to love our city together. I'm going to show you a video right now of a guy named Robert Ramiro. It was one of the videos that we showed at Together LA to explain kind of the purpose and the history behind Los Angeles. As it's shown, I'll come back and I'll tell you what we learned from the conference and how you can get involved with it too. But if you'll show that, that'd be great.
If Jesus were here today, which he is through us, where would he be? Would he be in Pacific Palisades? Would he be in South Pasadena? Would he be in San Marino? Well, he'd surely be in those places, right? He'd show up there. But he'd spend most of his time in East LA, in Boyle Heights, in Montebello, in Santana, right? In the IE. He'd be hanging out in the places that are looked down upon today. Those whom humankind rejects, God calls his own. Those whom we reject, God calls his own. The undocumented immigrants, the urban students in South LA, the single moms, single Latina moms, those most marginalized of society, God calls his own. And those of us who come from more privileged backgrounds, who don't come from Goshen, who don't come from Galilee, we need to take that to heart. About 100 years ago in LA was totally segregated by race and ethnicity. If you were Mexican, you lived in one part of town. If you were African American, you lived in another. If you were Asian, you lived with the African Americans and with the Asians. If you were Jewish, the same thing. LA was segregated according to these things called racial covenants. They said in the deeds of the houses, if someone bought the homes, the deeds would say, I agree to buy this home and never to sell it to a person who's Mexican, who's Chinese, who's Jewish, who's black. And so all of LA was carved up into segregated zones. There's real life consequences to this history. It's not just this abstract thing that happened 100 years ago. So why is it important for us to understand the history of segregation in Los Angeles? Why is it important for us to understand the racial inequalities which exist today in Los Angeles? Because our testimony is on the line. If we do not acknowledge and understand this history better than anybody else, if we don't see the suffering and the injustice that exists in our urban communities in Los Angeles better than anybody else, then our testimony is on the line. And we're just left out as irrelevant. People will write us off. Jesus is not just the God that wants me to go to heaven when I die, but he's the God that cares about my community that I come from, the struggle that I experience right now. And when they fall on their knees and are in love with Jesus and then are empowered to become professors, lawyers, teachers, urban youth workers, that's the most beautiful thing. That's what this is all about. In order for us to be able to effectively engage Los Angeles and empower indigenous leaders and bring community transformation from the bottom up, we need to pass on this history to our students, to our congregations, to everyone that we're committed to leading. When your eyes are open to the suffering of the people in Goshen, when your eyes are open to the circumstances of the people in Galilee, you'll never be the same again. You'll never be the same again.
So a person who helped us get the conference really going is a man named Michael Mata, who's a missiologist, a longtime Angelino who lives in Koreatown, and he had encouraged us to say, you really can't think about doing anything in terms of loving the city unless you start talking about the racial segregation in the city, unless you start talking about jobs and immigration that deal with all sorts of systemic issues that have long plagued different minorities in the city. So we started to meet with Hispanic communities and African American communities and Asian communities, and we started to ask that question: what does it mean for you to love the city? And we got all sorts of different answers. From the African American community, they said we need to talk about fatherlessness, we need to talk about jobs, we need to talk about long-term effects of discipleship within our church that has changed. When we got together with the Hispanic community, they said we need to talk about jobs too, but we need to talk about jobs in terms of immigration. We need to talk in terms of jobs about in a whole different way and shape and form. We need to talk about fatherlessness as well. We need to talk about all sorts of issues that deal with our community specifically. With the Asian community, there were questions that they had, the ways to answer ways in which we can love our city. So we came together and we asked them that, and then they would ask questions like, well, what is your mission statement? And we'd say, we don't have a mission statement until we get together and write it together. What's it mean for us to actually be together, to write together, to work together? What's it actually mean to start churches and start ministries and to start businesses that actually employ and foster and build relationships with those who look very different from us? So when we began to ask that question and we said, what does it mean to love the city? We came up with three things. It's not much different than caring for and loving your spouse or your children or your friends. You have to serve them. You have to encourage them. And at times you have to confront them. Those three things, we said, those are the ways in which we can love our city. We need to serve the people of the city. We need to serve the city. We need to encourage the people of the city, and we need to confront the injustice of the city. So I'm going to give you a few ways in which we can do that as we move forward. And I'll tell you what we're talking about now as Together LA and moving forward from that. We can serve the city. This is actually probably the call to action that may affect us in this room the most. These are the things that we can do as owners of businesses, as church leaders, as ministry leaders. These are the things that can actually affect serving our city. And that's equipping the people of the city. We can disciple them. We can use vocational training. We can use institutions like Biola, or David mentioned it earlier, Center for Faith and Work out of Redeemer. Those kinds of institutions are very, very good at helping to provide training and equipping of the people of this city. All different colors, backgrounds, all sorts of things that people may come into with different ideas, different expectations, different goals, but we can do that as we serve the city. That will help us engage in a way of loving Los Angeles like we've never seen. Another way that we can do it is we can encourage the people. And this is probably what the church does best. The church being the church. The church providing for things like David had mentioned in his talk just a minute ago, being the church, providing a refuge, providing a Sabbath for people to have a relief during their week. It is something that the world is not, and people know that, and they come to it. It's a shelter from capitalism. It's the church doing the things that only the church can do. It's Sunday worship. It's oriented towards God. It's not oriented towards me, where so much of the world is. We can encourage people by encouraging our church leaders to be the church, right? The last area is confronting the injustice. That's where organizations like Blythe's organization, Dress Simber, and Giving Keys, and Homeboy Industries, and all sorts of other ministries that are actually dealing with confronting injustice in our city come together. So those three things are the things that we think that will help our city be better. create an environment in which we've laid down our particular empires, where we've stopped saying, I'll build up my church, my ministry, my business, my whatever. It's for me and for my glory. And as long as you know the name of my institution, it'll be okay. We want to lay that down and we want to say, no more. We need to love our city together. When we serve the city, when we encourage the people, when we confront the injustice, we think that we'll be able to do that. Last Saturday, we had a very, very small group represented, last Friday, a very small group represented of our continuing steering committee of Together LA. And we haven't done anything with it since February. We had this conference. It started Thursday. We kicked it off. We had lots of people come on Thursday, lots of people on Friday. Our marketplace ministry took place Saturday, and then Saturday night we had a big citywide evangelistic event that Tim Keller spoke at. And then after that, we said it'd be a shame to let this go and do nothing with it. And we've done nothing with it. But that's really somewhat strategic. We never want to present ourselves as saying we have the answers, we know what to do now, we want to move forward in this way. We want everyone to have a voice in it, and that takes some time. That takes a lot of time for everyone to say, I feel this about this, I want to be heard, I want to have a voice, I want you to listen to me. So we gathered together last Friday with a very small representation of what we should do next. And what we came up with is that we need to have somewhat of an online platform that connects everyone together before we start to meet again. So we'll connect the different parts of the city with the different parts of the ministries. There'll be a map that identifies who's doing what and where, businesses that are offering opportunities for folks. There'll be all sorts of things that you'll see this develop over time. We'll start having some information public in the next little bit. Videos made, some information on the website about how we can love our city better. Last thing I'll close with is kind of this interesting little juxtaposition of getting the folks in Los Angeles together. But we held the conference at West Angeles Church of God in Christ, which is Bishop Charles E. Blake's congregation. It's a wonderful church. It's great in so many ways. But it is very much a wonderful example of an African-American gospel church. And that night that Bishop Blake spoke, we had their choir, their band playing, and it was a great, wonderful worship experience for us. And those of us who aren't used to it all the time got to experience a different avenue to worship together. It was great. It was wonderful. The juxtaposition is this. In between worship and Bishop Blake speaking, we had Father Greg Boyle come and speak. And if you know who Greg Boyle is, you know he just lays it as it is. So here we are in this giant African-American church with the bishop just about to speak, and Greg Boyle walks out, and he's just Greg Boyle. He starts talking about his homies and his ministry, and he's cussing all the way through it. Right? He's just laying it out there. You know, my homie told me, he texted me and he said, OHN, and I'm asking what that is, and that means all hell no. And then I'm looking at the bishop and I'm thinking, this white kid's gonna get kicked out of here. We are not gonna be able to do what we wanna do because this is not gonna go well in this church. And Bishop Blake got up right afterwards, and Greg Boyle got a standing ovation coming in, got a standing ovation going out. And Bishop Blake got up afterwards and said, I didn't exactly know what I was getting into, but we're behind this. And anytime that I see Hispanics and whites and Asians and African Americans together in a representative like this, that's a view of heaven that I hope we see more and more of. That was fun. That was what the church should be. That's what our ministry hopes to be. Through lots of little tiny avenues, little businesses, little churches, little tiny folks saying, my empire is not bigger than the kingdom of God. So that's what we did with Together LA, and that's what I'd hope to encourage you to think about as you move forward. How can you love our city better? Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.